We continue now at the top of Daf Chesam and Beis Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf 8b. This summit is sponsored by Alexander Rosenfeld in memory of Shmuel Zev ben Aaron Rosenfeld. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you'd like to sponsor an Amid or a Daf, see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing how it is that we know that the Psukim in Sefer Bamidbar Perek Tezvav are dealing with Avodah Zarah, and the Gemara now brings the approach of Devei Rabbi Yishmael. Devei Rabbi Yishmael taught that it says in the Pasuk, L'min hayom asher tziva Hashem v'hola l'dorosechem, it says from the day that Hashem commanded and onward, Ezu hi mitzvah shi nemra betchila, what mitzvah was said first? Haveyomer zu avodas kochavim, that mitzvah is Avodah Zarah. And Rashi explains, L'min hayom hachi mashma, it's understood as follows. It's called asher tziva Hashem elokechem biad Moshe dezu avodas kochavim. Again, this pasuk is referring to Avodah Zarah. Uminayin shezu avodas kochavim. And how do we know that this pasuk is referring to Avodah Zarah? Midichsib behedji l'min hayom asher tziva Hashem v'hola. It means shar mitzvahs v'hola. The other mitzvahs would be given after. Kilomar mikan v'elech l'dorosechem. From here onward would be other mitzvahs. Ezuhi mitzvah shenemra betchila. So which mitzvah was said first? Haveyomer zu avodas kochavim. That was Avodah Zarah. What do we mean that it was said first? Tichsiv, as it's written, betchilas aseres hadibros. That's what was written in the beginning of the aseres hadibros. Anochi v'lo yelecha dahainu avodas kochavim. The first of the aseres hadibros were Anochi and lo yelecha, and that is referring to Avodah Zarah. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'ha'amar mar, but didn't the master say, Eser mitzvahs netztavu Yisrael b'Morah, that there were actually 10 mitzvahs given in Morah that were before the Aseres HaDibros, and so therefore Avodah Zarah was not first, and so the Gemara says, Ela machvarta kiddushanin and meikara, rather go back to the answers that we gave before. And Rashi explains, Yud mitzvahs netztavu b'Morah, dahainu kodem matan Torah. Morah was before matan Torah. Alma avodas kochavim lo nemra tchili. You see that Avodah Zarah was not first, and so the Gemara said, Machvarta kiddushanin and meikara kedivrei Rabbi Yosha ben Levi, o kedivrei Rabbi, rather go back to the earlier answers on the previous summit, either like Rabbi Yosha ben Levi or like Rabbi. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ein chayovin al asei v'al los asei shebemikdash. One is not chayev by positive commandments and negative commandments by the Beis HaMikdash. This is talking about in terms of the par helam davar shel tzibor. Ve'ein mevi'in asham taloi, and similarly one doesn't bring an asham taloi. Again, that's the carbon asham that is brought when one is not sure if they're chayev to bring a chatos, but you don't bring an asham taloi al asei v'al los asei shebemikdash, again by positive and negative commandments by the Beis HaMikdash. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Avol chayovin al asei v'al los asei shebenida. However, one is chayev when it comes to positive and negative commandments by nida. That's talking again about the par helam davar shel tzibor. Umeviim asham taloi al asei v'al los asei shebenida. And similarly, one does bring an asham taloi by asei and los asei by nida. Ezu hi mitzvahs asei shebenida. What is the positive commandment by nida? That's parosh min hanida. That's to separate from the nida. Umitzvahs los asei, and what's the negative commandment by nida? Al tavo al hanida. That's not to have relations with the nida. And Rashi explains, Ein bezin chayav and carbon al asei v'al los asei shebemikdash. Again, the bezin is not chayav a carbon by the positive and negative commandments of the mikdash. Dahainu tumas mikdash v'kadash. If that's talking about tumah, impurity by the mikdash or by kodesh. Asei shebemikdash. Now the positive commandment by the mikdash is v'yishalchu min hamachane called sarua. You have to be sent out of the machane if tamei. And los asei v'lo yitamu es machaneim. The los asei is don't make their machane tamei. Sha'af al pishu davar shezadono kares v'shigagaso chatas. And Rashi now explains, even though tumas mikdash v'kadashav is something which if done on purpose is kares and by mistake is a chatas, hoel ve'ein shigagaso chatas kavua, but since it's not the fixed carbon chatas, rather ela carbon chatas ola v'yored, rather it's the variable carbon chatas that is brought in these situations. The variable carbon chatas changes depending upon how wealthy the person is, whether he brings an animal, a bird, whether he brings a mincha. Hilkach, therefore, pater legamri kidem efarish begamar. Therefore, if it's a carbon ola v'yored, it's completely pater, again, when it comes to the par helam davar shel tzibor. V'hayde katani ein chayavin al asei v'al los asei shebemikdash lo kamayri b'koin Mashiach klal. Now Rashi also notes this discussion over here of not being chayav and asei and los asei shebemikdash is not talking at all about koin gadol. This is just talking about the par helam davar shel tzibor. Mishum dave pluksa Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva, because that actually is subject to a machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva lo pater leimi par al tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Rabbi Akiva says the koin gadol is not exempt from bringing the par by tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Rabbi Shimon pater le lagamri, and Rabbi Shimon says he is completely exempt. Kidem efarish begamar b'sof pirkin, as will be explained in the Gemara at the end of our perek. And Rashi continues, Ve'ein mevi'in yechidin, individuals, they don't bring asham taloi, they don't bring an asham taloi, al aseh ve'alos aseh shebe mikdash, on an aseh, and on a los aseh, again, that has to do with tumas mikdash v'kadashav. And Rashi explains, De'ein asham taloi ba, you don't bring an asham taloi, elo al safek chatas kavua, unless you have a situation of a doubt whether you have to bring a regular carbon chatas, a fixed carbon chatas, kedem mefarish b'gemara, as the Gemara will explain. And so therefore, when it comes to tumas mikdash v'kadashav, there we're talking about a chatas that is an olav yored. We're talking about a variable chatas, and therefore there's no asham taloi. And again, that's talking about individuals that they don't bring the asham taloi by aseh and los aseh shebe mikdash. And Rashi notes aval bebezin, but in terms of bezdin bringing the asham taloi, so lo itzrich lemisna, that actually the Mishnah doesn't even need to teach. Ein mevi'in asham taloi al aseh v'al los aseh shebe mikdash. You don't have to say that bezdin doesn't bring an asham taloi an aseh and los aseh in the mikdash. Sharei ein bezdin mevi'in asham taloi, because bezdin never brings an asham taloi. Afilu b'makom safek chatas kavua, even in a situation where there's a doubt if there's a fixed chatas, even there the bezdin is not going to bring an asham taloi, because the bezdin's never going to bring an asham taloi. Kedamrinan b'reish pirkin, like we say at the beginning of our parak. And Rashi quotes from the beginning of the parak, Mashiach bepar, it says again, the Kohen Gadol brings a par, ve'ein mevi asham taloi, he doesn't bring an asham taloi, techsib asham taloi, v'chipar olav ha'kohen al shigagaso asher shogag, because it says by the asham taloi that it's a kapara on his mistake, asher shogag, on the mistake that he made. And we understand that to mean, as we said earlier, misha chataso v'shigagaso shav, it has to be that the chet and the shogag are the same, yotza Mashiach, that excludes the Kohen Gadol, umenolan de'ein chataso v'shigagaso shav. And how do we know the Kohen Gadol, his chait and his shogeg are not one? Techsiv li'ashmas ha'am, it says li'ashmas ha'am over there, harei Mashiach ketzibor, that the Kohen Gadol is like the tzibor, meaning again, the tzibor tzrichen helim davrim shigagas ma'isa, because the tzibor and the Kohen Mashiach as well, the Kohen Gadol as well, they need both helim davar and shigagas ma'isa. That's what it means to say that it's not chataso v'shigagaso shave. Lafikach, therefore, eino ba'asham taloi, therefore it's not included in asham taloi. Hilkach ki itzrich ein mevi asham taloi, al asevi therefore, where it's necessary for the Mishnah to teach that there's no asham taloi and aseh and los aseh shavimikdash, that's just kagon b'yachad di'alma, that's just by an individual, because again, when it comes to the bezin, they're not going to bring an asham taloi anyhow. And Rashi continues, avol chayovin bezdin al aseh ve'al los aseh shabinida, but bezdin does have to bring the par by the aseh and los aseh involving nida. To have a zidono kares v'shigagaso chatos, that's a case again of zidono kares and shigagaso chatos. If it's done on purpose, it's kares. By mistake, it's a chatos kavu, as a fixed chatos. Umevin yechidim asham taloi al aseh v'al los aseh shabinida. So individuals do bring the asham taloi by aseh and los aseh by nida. Misham to have a safek chatos kavua, because that's a situation of a safek chatos kavua. Al tavo al hanida, and again the Mishnah explained what is the aseh and the los aseh by nida. So al tavo al hanida don't have relations with a nida. D'chsiv ve'al isha b'nidas tumasa lo sikrav, that's the los aseh, and the aseh is paroshmin hanida, separate from the nida. Kilomar b'samach levesta, meaning when it's close to the time that she's expecting her period. Kadesha lo te'roeh b'shas tashmish, that way she won't see at the time of the act of having relations. D'chsiv, as it's written, v'izartem es b'nei Yisrael, separate b'nei Yisrael, k'nem mefarish b'gemara b'Meseches Shvuos b'perak Yedias hatoma, as is explained in the Gemara in Meseches Shvuos. And the Gemara says, Menohani mili the tzibor lo mechayvi korban bialma. From where do we know that the tzibor is not chayiv to bring the korban, to bring the par, in a situation where it is not a chatos kavua? V'yachid asham taloi namilo. And how do we know also by the individual that he's not going to bring an asham taloi if it's not a situation of chatos kavua? How do we know there's this requirement of chatos kavua? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, Nemar v'ashem b'chatos u'v'asham taloi. It uses the word v'ashem by chatos and by asham taloi. V'nemar v'ashemu b'tzibor, and it uses the word v'ashemu b'tzibor, and so we compare all of them. Ma v'ashem b'yachid b'chatos kvua, just like v'ashem by the individual, that's talking about a fixed chatos. Af v'ashemu b'tzibor b'chatos kvua, so too v'ashemu by the tzibor is by chatos kvua. Umat tzibor b'chatos kvua, and just like tzibor is by chatos kavua, af asham taloi nami ein bo ella al safek chatos kavua. So to asham taloi, it's only going to be brought on a situation of a safek of a chatos kavua, not by the carbon ola v'yored. And the Gemara continues, Amri, they said ihachi, if so, carbon ola v'yored nami, but by a carbon ola v'yored as well, by a variable chatos as well. Haksiv, doesn't it say? Isn't it written in the pasuk? V'hayachi yesham le'achas me'ela. It uses the word yesham. That's similar to v'yashem. So why don't we compare that? And the Gemara continues and answers, Donin Ashemu min Ashem, we learn Ashemu from Ashem, those words are similar. V'ein Donin Ashem min Yesham, but we're not going to learn the word Ashem from Yesham, those are two different words. But the Gemara asks, so my nafkamina, what difference does it make that the words are slightly different? We have Gezerah Shavis where the words are not exactly the same. V'hatani devei Rabbi Yishmael, but wasn't it taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael? V'shav hakohen uva hakohen. It talks about the kohen returning and the kohen coming. This is talking about by tzaras, and we make comparisons. Zuhi shiva, zuhi bia, that the rules are similar by shiva, by returning, and the rules are similar by bia. And so you see, we make Gezerah Shavis even though the words are not exactly the same. V'yoden further, Nelef min v'yashem mitumas mikdash v'kadashav. We can also learn from the word v'yashem. That's by tumas mikdash v'kadashav, and again, that's talking about a variable chatos. T'chsiv, that it's written over there, v'hu tamei v'yashem. It uses the word v'yashem. So still, you have other places where you can learn. You'd be able to learn to variable chatos. And the Gemara says, Amar Papa says, Donin v'yashem u'mitzvahs Hashem, min v'yashem u'mitzvahs Hashem. We learn where it says v'yashem together with the phrase u'mitzvahs Hashem. We learn from the other place where it says the same thing. It has to say all of that, and therefore that is specifically by chatos kavua. But the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Shimi bar Ashi le Rav Papa. Rav Shimi bar Ashi said to Rav Papa, V'neilef v'yashem u'nesias avon, min v'yashem u'nesias avon. Why not learn v'yashem together with a phrase having to do with nesias avon, carrying the burden of the sin from a situation of Yashem and Nesias Avon, and again, that would apply by variable chatas as well. Elamar of Nachman bar Yitzchak, rather, of Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Donin v'yashem u'mitzvahs Hashem asher lo seyasena. You learn when it says v'yashem and it says mitzvahs Hashem asher lo seyasena, you learn that from mi v'yashem u'mitzvahs Hashem asher lo seyasena. The other place where it says that, v'al yochiach shmias kol u'vitois vasayim v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav, when it comes to the situations of shmias kol, bitois vasayim, tumas mikdash v'kadashav, again the variable chatos, shelo nemar bohem v'yashem u'mitzvahs Hashem asher lo seyasena. There it doesn't use that phrase, v'yashem mitzvahs Hashem asher lo seyasena, and therefore again we learn that these apply specifically by chatos kavua and not by the carbon ola v'yored. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ein chayavin al shmias kol ve'al bitois vasayim ve'al tumas mikdash v'kadashav. The bezin is not chayav to bring the carbon on a case of shmias kol, bitois vasayim and tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Those were the cases that were just mentioned. Again, those are cases of carbon ola v'yored. The bezin only brings a carbon by a chatos kavua, by the fixed chatos. Shmias kol here refers to a situation where a person is taking an oath that he doesn't know testimony in a particular case. If he takes a false oath, that is a violation. Bitois vasayim means in general a false oath, and tumas mikdash v'kadashav is what was mentioned in the previous Mishnah. Again, in a situation of tumas mikdash v'kadashav, it's a carbon ola v'yored, and that's why the bezdin is not chayiv. And Rashi explains, Ein bezdin chayavin al shmias kol v'al bitois vasayim v'al tumas mikdash v'kadashav dechol hani havin b'carbon ola v'yored. All of these are cases of carbon ola v'yored. They're all these sliding scale variable carbon chatos. Kedamrin le'el, like we said earlier, the tzibur ein mevi'in chatos ela b'kavua. The tzibur is only going to bring a chatos in a situation where it is kavua, where it is a fixed chatos. Uvedinu delo yiboy lemisna. Now Rashi notes, we really didn't have to teach this. We just taught about tumas mikdash v'kadashav in the last Mishnah. Dehatana le'el ein chayavin al asei v'al lo sasei shebemikdash. We said that they're not chayiv by the positive, negative commandments in the mikdash. Ve'amrinan misham deboin tzibur b'chatos kavua. And we said the reason is because it needs to be with the chatos kavua. V'tumas mikdash v'kadashav have a ba'ola v'yored. And tumas mikdash v'kadashav, as we said, is not a chatos kavua. It's ola v'yored. It's a variable chatos. V'hu adin al shmias kol ve'al bitois vasayim. The same is true by shmias kol. Again, that's when the person has to take an oath that he doesn't know testimony. And bitois vasayim, which also refers to a false oath. To lo have a chatos kavua. That's not a chatos kavua. The bezin potter. So of course bezin will be exempt. So the question is, why are we repeating it over here in this Mishnah? V'hayda katani hacha. The reason why it's being taught over here, ein bezin chayavin al shmias kol, that the bezin is not chayav on shmias kol. Misham deboy fluge Rabbi Yossi Haglili Rabbi Akiva. We're about to see this. Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Akiva are going to argue, ein bezdin chayavin al shmias kol ve'al bitois vasayim v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav v'hu adin l'mashiach. The question is going to be in terms of, as we'll see in a moment, we'll see with the nasi and we'll see with the kohen gadol. And the Mishnah continues, V'hanasi kayotze bohem divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. The nasi, the king, is the same. He doesn't bring the carbon ola v'yored. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Akiva says, Hanasi chayev b'kulin. The nasi actually is chayev in all of these, chutz mishmias hakol, except for shmias hakol, because he's never asked to testify. Shahamelech lo don v'lo don enoso, because a king, he doesn't judge, they don't judge him. Lo meid v'lo meid enoso, he doesn't testify, and they don't testify against him. And Rashi explains, "V'hanasi kayotze behen." The nasi, the king, is the same, meaning de'eno bekarban ola v'yorei divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says he's not included in the category of bringing a karban ola v'yorei, the variable chatos. Taimad Rabbi Yossi Aglili mefarish b'Gemara, and the reason of Rabbi Yossi Aglili will be explained in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva Omer hanasi chayiv b'kulan. Rabbi Akiva says the nasi is chayiv in all of these bekarban ola v'yorei. He does bring the karban ola v'yorei in these cases, chutz mishmias kol, except for the case of shmias kol. Again, when the person is supposed to take an oath that he does not know testimony, she'ein shmias kol chol olav. There is no shmias kol by a king. She'amelech lo don v'lo don enoso, lo meid v'lo meid enoso, kedetnan b'Meseches Sanhedrin, b'pera kohen gadol, because the king, again, he doesn't judge, he's not judged, and he doesn't testify, and he's not testified against. For Rabbi Akiva now, in terms of Rabbi Akiva, b'Mashiach lo perish b'masnisin. In terms of Rabbi Akiva's opinion by a kohen gadol, it's not explained in the Mishnah, upirish b'braisa, but it will be explained in the Braisa, kedamrinon lekamon b'braisa, like we're going to say later on in the Braisa. Tanya Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, Mashiach potter mikulan, that the Kohen Gadol is potter in all of these mikarban ola v'yored. He's potter from karban ola v'yored, umevi al kulan par, and he does bring in all of these cases a par. He brings a bull. Kedamrinan b'sof pirkin, Rabbi Akiva lo potter le mi par, like we're going to say at the end of our parak, that Rabbi Akiva does not exempt him from the par. And the Gemara says, Amar Ula says, my time at Rabbi Yossi Aglili. What's the reason of Rabbi Yossi Aglili that the nasi does not bring the karban ola v'yored? Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, V'hoya ki yesham la'achas me'ela. By the karban ola v'yored, it says that if he's guilty in one of these cases, we understand that to mean kol shem mischayev ba'achas, mischayev b'kulan. If he's chayev in one, he's chayev in all. V'shein mischayev ba'achas, ein mischayev b'kulan. If he's not chayev in one of them, then he's not chayev in all of them. Meaning, as we said, there is no concept of shmias kol by the king, because he doesn't have to take an oath not to testify, because he doesn't testify. And so therefore, since shmias kol doesn't apply to the nasi, therefore the rest of them, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, they don't apply to the nasi as well. And the Gemara continues, V'ema mischai ba'achas mehen v'afa pishein mischai b'kulan. Well, why not say the opposite? He's chayiv in one of them, even if he's not chayiv in all of them. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather, time of Rabbi Yossi Aglili mehacha. Really, the reason of Rabbi Yossi Aglili is from here, from the following. Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Hoyer Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer, Rabbi Yirmiyah would say, Nemar, it says, and Rashi explains, V'hoya ki yesham la'achas me'ela, ta'ashmias kol uvito esfasayim v'tumas mikdosh v'kadosh of koi. This pasuk is going on those three cases of the karban ola v'yored, shmias kol, v'ito esfasayim, tumas mikdosh v'kadosh, because Savar Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds, ki yesham li'achas hochi mashma. You should understand the pasuk as follows. Kol sheyesh bi'achas, kolomar, if you're commanded in every single one of these cases, meschayev karban b'kulan, then you bring a karban in all of the cases. V'shein meschayev b'achas, but if you're exempt from even one of them, ein meschayev b'kulan, then you're exempt from all of them. V'nasi hol v'eno meschayev b'achas mehen dahainu b'shmias kol. The nasi, since he's not liable by shmias kol because he's out of that category, ein meschayev b'kulan, so he's not chayev in any of them. Depater mikulan, he's exempt from all of them. But the Gemara then asked, Ve'ema ki yesham li'achas hachi mashma. Why not say that the pasuk ki yesham should be understood as follows? Ki yafshar sheyehei mischayev afilu ba'achas mehan. If it's possible that he's chayev in one of them, afal pishein mischayev b'kulan, even though he's not chayev in all of them, have a chayev, that he actually is chayev. V'nasi nami, and say by the nasi as well, afal pishein o chayev b'shmias kol, even though he's not chayev in shmias kol, yeh chayev b'bito isfasayim, v'tomas mikdash v'kadoshav, he's chayev by bito isfasayim, and tomas mikdash v'kadoshav. And so the Gemara instead says, Alatam Rabbi Yossi Aglili mehacha, and the reason of Rabbi Yossi Aglili is from here, Nemar b'shmias kol uvito isfasayim v'tomas mikdash v'kadoshav. It says by shmias kol bito isfasayim and tomas mikdash v'kadoshav, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tes Amud Aleph.